Proportional Response, Book 1, Chapter 14, Part 8, Some Costly Arrogance. Eldia's attention went to the female Zoltan Alira as the woman clicked her talons together, a gesture she knew to be very similar to a Venter or human clucking their tongue. The Zoltan woman spoke towards her hand, specifically toward her unsheathed claws, but her words seemed to be pitched towards the arrogant male ex-Zoltan. What you are seeing is puzzlement on their faces, young man. Their translators did not manage the word Kusaidikat very well, and I think I can understand why. The Zoltan woman turned to Henry. The word is complex, with shades of meaning that grows out of the game as displayed by non-voters. And make no mistake that there are many of the underclass who play as hard as, or harder than, the voters, currying favor to try to break into those upper ranks. She turned hard eyes on the newcomer. So very few succeed, though many die trying. The young man held her gaze with a smirk. Eldia moved to the couch, dragging Henry with her, as Alira continued. A not too far off simple translation would be double agent, but this is much tighter. It is someone offering information to a rival faction because they expect compensation, and because they expect that the rival's use of the information will benefit them somehow, usually by having an internal rival to their own plans removed. There are a lot of expectations around someone playing the Kusaidikat, but the biggest one is that the one receiving the information is supposed to forget where that information came from. Usually, a Kusaidikat will give their information to a non-voter of a rival faction, and that non-voter will present the information to their superiors as something they gained through their own cunning and prowess. Alira's eyes narrowed again, and she showed her teeth. It is something of an insult for this man to sit in your living room, boss, and claim himself Kusaidikat to you. He should have just given his information to me and gone back into his hole. But I think he expects payment beyond what I can give. The Zoltan snorted at her and raised one side of his lip. You had a price I would have accepted, voter tramp, but you herk. The young man's words were cut off by Alira's hand on his throat. Eldia had to think about it. The other woman's hand had moved so fast to realize that Alira's claws were still out as well. No one moved for a moment as Alira pushed the Zoltan man backward and upwards in the chair while his hands and feet scrabbled for purchase. Eldia looked at the other men in the room and saw a bunch of relaxed postures, with none of them showing any concern for the proceedings. The Zoltan man suddenly stopped moving and let his own claws come out, moving one of them towards Alira. That is when the armed soldier moved to press the barrel of his weapon squarely against the sputtering Zoltan as he tried to breathe. The man's claws retracted by inches as he turned furious eyes on the gun pointed at his head. He then relaxed and turned back to look at Alira. She snarled and locked eyes with him. You will never ever refer to me that way again, bootlicker scum. Not here, not now, not somewhere else, not even in the cold of the night in your own mind. I am a free woman, in a way that a plebe so busy deep-throating the boot on his neck couldn't possibly understand. Now, I suggest you tell these nice humans whatever it is you have to say, which you decided was too important to tell the woman you clumsily, ineptly, charmlessly, and without even a prayer of success, pretended to try and seduce in order to get it here, before they let me rend your head from your shoulders. Eldia sat back and smiled slightly as Alira released her hold and sort of flowed back over to her own chair, then sat as if nothing had happened. Watching that woman come into her own has been interesting. The man sat there wheezing and looking daggers at Alira, with his claws coming out slightly and retracting before turning back to look at Henry. Do something about your little Alira made a sudden movement in her chair, and the soldier with the gun shifted his weight. The Zoltan snarled slightly, then continued. About that woman, or I tell you nothing. Henry got a pensive look on his face for a moment, then nodded. Very well. He turned to Alira. I am giving you a 2 weeks pay bonus for bringing whatever this matter is to my attention. Another week's bonus for not killing this pissant before bringing him here. And a week's pay for not ripping his arteries out in my living room and making a mess all over the carpet. He turned back to the Zoltan and raised an eyebrow at him. Would you like me to do more, or will that be sufficient? The Zoltan shot to his feet in a huff or tried to. The soldier's hand landed on his shoulder and pushed him back down into the chair. He sat for a moment, with a puzzled look on his face, then anger, and exclaimed, "I will not be treated like this. I demand that you..." Eldia felt her own blood begin to rise as the Zoltan tried to rise against the iron grip of the human soldier. Henry looked at her, shrugged, and turned to leave. She smiled, threw a mocking look at the Zoltan, and turned to follow her man. The Zoltan's voice grew later. "Where are you going?" "I have..." Henry stopped and turned slightly, looking over his shoulder. "Something you think is of extremely high value. However, you seem to have a hopelessly inflated opinion of yourself, your competence, your negotiating skills, and your way with women. And I think your estimation of this information's value is similarly inflated." Henry lifted one side of his upper lip in the best approximation of a sultan sneer Eldia had ever seen before he continued. "You are in no position to make demands of any kind, and if you try to do so again, I will happily have you tossed out on your ear, rather than letting you walk out of here under your own power. Now, I happen to have plenty to do in the morning, and you have interrupted my sleep." Henry raised his gaze to look at the soldier, then waved vaguely with his hand. "See this jerk out through the front door, and don't let him give you his lips." Eldia turned to go, her eyebrows drawn together. "Give his lips? Why do translators have so much trouble with idioms sometimes? I am going to have to step up my English lessons." She then looked around in puzzlement, again, upon realizing that they hadn't cleared the few steps to the bedroom door yet. She'd automatically fallen in step with her boyfriend, but he seemed to be in no hurry to get back to his room. A panicked voice sounded behind them. "Wait, you can't throw me out that door. Not right now. I will be... hurt." Eldia glanced behind her to see that the human soldier had put the man in some sort of odd hold, which would have broken the arm of a venter, and probably done some damage to a human, but seemed to be merely uncomfortable to the lizard. A hand on the Exaltan's neck seemed to be making further speech difficult. Something seemed to have lit a fire under the man, though, because he managed to gasp out a few strangled words. "I am a hacker, and I know why. Your hackers have been losing. Henry turned abruptly, and the soldier stopped trying to manhandle the lizard towards the door. Eldia glanced over to check on Alira, and saw that the woman had her claws out and a dark grin on her face. The Exaltan woman seemed to sense her gaze and glanced back at her. She then got a sheepish look on her face, sheathed her claws, and schooled her features. Eldia winked at her as Henry motioned to the soldier, who responded by loosening the pressure on his captive's throat enough that the man could speak. Desperation played out in the man's eyes, but his voice came out with conviction behind it. "I know the secret to our recent success in cyber warfare against you, and I will even tell you that it is going to get worse for you. Your firewalls have been breached, which you know, but you don't know all of the breaches, and more importantly, you don't know that your second honeypot has been breached and recognized for what it is. I can tell you why, but I want a lot in return." Henry stood there and scowled at the man, then nodded to the soldier, who released his prisoner. Henry gestured for the Zoltan to take a seat, pushed a few buttons on his comms unit, and leaned forward to speak. "You could have led with that to Alira here, and we could have avoided a lot of unpleasantness." He waved a hand and looked away for just a moment. "No matter, I guess. It sounds like you may have information worth trading. Tell me what you want." The Zoltan sat back in his chair and smiled slightly. He shot an ugly look at Alira that made Eldia want to box his ears. Alira, however, simply ignored the man and sat there examining her unsheathed claws. Henry cleared his throat loudly, and the Zoltan looked back at him and spoke. "Money, first and foremost. A lot of it in a numbered account at a central clearinghouse bank. And don't ask me what I want. You tell me a number, and if it is not enough, I'll go ahead and let you toss me out the front door. There are others who would pay handsomely for what I know. Second, I want to be smuggled out of your god-awful embassy as soon as we finish our negotiations, and back to the bar where I was chatting with this woman. Third, I want your assurance that you will act on what I give you within a week." Eldia felt her eyebrows come down in confusion. That is an odd sort of request. Something... Alira began to chuckle. a small melodious sound completely at odds with the rapt attention the woman seemed to be paying to the process of filing her claws. The Zoltan woman glanced at Henry and a smile formed on her face. "Boss, you shouldn't let this boy bilk you out of money. It is against all custom for this sort of deal. He has information which, if you act on it, will advance his own career." Illyra splayed her hand out in front of her and studied her claws, the small smile still on her face. "My guess is that whoever is causing you trouble is a rival of his, and he wants that rival removed, is even desperate for the rival to be removed. Of course, the reason he wants the money in a numbered account is because he is in a position where he and his accounts are watched closely. My guess is that he thinks he can get himself voting rights in a few years, and that account is going to either be to help him establish himself or act as a fallback if he fails. Too bad for him that I know the steps of the game well enough to know this, and that I have been irritated enough by his behavior to tell you what I know." Eldia had to suppress a smile as Illyra lowered her head slightly and batted her eyelashes at the Zoltan man, who sat there and fumed. Henry stood there and studied the man for a few moments. Then the door to the living room opened, and the sloppiest, grumpiest-looking human she'd ever seen walked in the door. The man moved with a certain speed, though, despite both his bulk and the fact that he was staring at a pad instead of where he was going. Henry looked up at the man and smiled. "Sorry to roust you from whatever you were doing, Jake, but our friend here," Henry gestured vaguely towards the bristling Zoltan, "claims he knows who is behind the Zoltan's sudden proficiency in computer hacking. My money is still that it is one of those insectoid biffa." Henry turned to the Zoltan, who looked over at Jake with disdain. "So, now that I have someone here who can verify your claims, speak your piece. I promise you that, if your information is sound, we will act on it quickly and see to it that you are spirited away from here with no one the wiser."